We're all doomed! Well, maybe we're not, but there will undoubtedly be plenty of coverage regarding Sony's recent financials, and especially their perspective as it relates to Bungie and Destiny 2. So, Sony have just released a report of the results from the second quarter of fiscal year 2025, and as you might expect, that conversation includes Bungie, both Marathon, which of course is coming up, and Destiny 2, where essentially Sony recognized that they've made a loss on the Bungie acquisition so far, and they make comments about Bungie's performance overall and the declining performance of Destiny 2, so given that lots of people will speak about this, I guess we will as well. So this report just came out today. For general context around Sony and PlayStation, they've said that PlayStation is generally performing pretty well, good console sales, strong engagement, and sales for game titles across the board. Obviously with some caveats, but on the most part, Sony are doing pretty well for themselves with PlayStation. From the reporting though, they additionally speak about Marathon, and they continue to indicate that the game should release in the fiscal year of 2025, so they still essentially plan a release by the end of March 2026. And PlayStation also cite the recent technical test as being more promising, with a release date still expected to reveal this fall. And that's what Bungie had previously said a few months back, so almost certainly we're going to hear more about Marathon very soon. But getting into the stuff that pertains to Destiny 2, the Game Post have an article here. Sony says D2's sales and user engagement have not reached what it expected when it bought Bungie, and they're downwardly revising projections as it records a $204 million impairment loss on Bungie assets. So we'll read through it first, and then we'll try and explain a bit of what it actually means. So Sony have acknowledged what many Destiny 2 players have felt this year. Engagement is down, and over the last few months, Destiny 2's player numbers have slipped to new lows on Steam, and based on API-driven estimates, they've fallen below the lows that were seen in the Curse of Osiris era in 2018. This also highlights that community sentiment has been pretty rough. But from the reports this week, Sony have now put a hard number on the business impact of this, where they've recorded an impairment tied to Bungie's Destiny 2 assets, and they say it has downwardly revised its projections for the near term. So there's kind of a bit of accounting speak, I guess, going on here, something I'm not massively familiar with. It does essentially recognize a loss, though, in the purchase of Bungie. So on their accounts, there's a write-down of roughly $204 million US, where during a pre-recorded message as part of Sony's financial presentation, they stated that Destiny 2 has fallen short of what Sony anticipated when it bought Bungie for $3.6 billion in 2022. And she explained that the impairment is against a portion of Bungie's intangible and other assets in connection with Destiny 2, along with expenses tied to development cost corrections, which they identify as the main reasons for PlayStation's gaming segment actually seeing a drop in operating income despite an overall sales increase during Q2 of 2025. So a basic way of looking at that is that despite good performance in general, Destiny's performance has actually managed to pull down on the company's overall estimates. And this is what one of their financial officers said. So regarding Destiny 2, partially due to the changes in the competitive environment, the level of sales and user engagement have not reached the expectation we had at the time of acquisition of Bungie. While we will continue to make improvements, we've downwardly revised the business projection for the time being and recorded an impairment loss against a portion of the assets of Bungie. During a Q&A on this call though, folks asked about whether this impairment could be the start of more write-downs tied to Bungie, and she clarified that the goodwill from Bungie acquisition is tied to the broader PlayStation segment, and other Bungie assets like Destiny 2 and Marathon still carry value that could be reduced in the future if they don't perform. And they highlight that intangible assets are the target for the impairment loss they're actually referencing. But they go on to say we still have some intangible assets and the question of whether there is still any risk remaining or not. Marathon, which is going to be launched, and Destiny 2, if the performance does not reach what we expect, of course, carries a risk of impairment loss in the future again, but we don't believe this will impact the whole game segment, at least at this point in time, and that's in reference to Sony's wider performance, so it's not obviously just about Bungie and what Destiny is doing. But the article reiterates that Sony did acquire Bungie in early 2022 for $3.6 billion, and roughly $1.2 billion of that was set aside as retention incentives for Bungie employees. So some of that was purely about the talent that Bungie have, and the fact that they will go on to make other Bungie games or Sony titles in the future, and it basically means that Sony can leverage that talent, and they recognize that as a big chunk of the overall value of Bungie. But the article finishes by highlighting that Sony recently said that Bungie's autonomy is getting lighter as it absorbs more of the Destiny 2 developer. So essentially, Sony are talking about a $200 million miss, which isn't really far off, the potential profits of some games. And obviously that will be a component of why we saw people like Pete Parsons step away a few months back. But an asset impairment loss is basically, as far as I understand it, taking the original market value of the asset, or at least what Sony paid for it, and then subtracting the current market value, which essentially means they value Bungie at less than what they bought it for. So it's a recognition of that, and the impairment loss component is how they technically recognize that on their books. Which in itself isn't necessarily a huge surprise, right? Because when Sony paid that huge amount of money, $3.6 billion for Bungie, there were a lot of raised eyebrows, especially given that Bungie's performance had already started to decline at that point. So if there's one thing Pete Parsons did very well, it was managing to sell Bungie to Sony at that point. We should also reiterate that out of $3.6 billion, $200 million is a relatively small amount, so it isn't necessarily the end of the world at this precise moment, but it does indicate that Sony recognized the difference between what they paid and what they think the current value is, and obviously this is ongoing, so we still have another period of time over the summer and the remainder of 2025 before we'll get a better idea of how these numbers actually look for a full year, but we can probably anticipate that it won't get better, right? And for Q2 of 2025, obviously, that would have been a point in time where Bungie were actually selling Year of Prophecy, right? Edge of Fate and everything else that was going to come out. Obviously, they will still make some sales for things like Renegades as we lead up to it. But looking at Destiny's cycle, it tends to be, as they kind of lead up to the big expansion, that's where the bulk of the pre-orders and things will actually occur. So it's a very huge part of their financial year. And we'll absolutely be seeing some of that reflected in these numbers from Sony. With the indication, though, looking more broadly at Bungie and Sony's relationship, that there is still a plan to release Marathon before the end of the financial year. Again, that goes up to March 2026, so there's a bit of time. But it means however Marathon performs will also factor into this year. And by that point, we'll have had the release of Renegades, and if Bungie do plan any expansions for 2026 that they're actually gonna forecast and kind of let us know about and maybe start pre-orders for before the end of 2025's financial year, then that could also factor into it as well. So basically, by the middle of next year, we'll have a much better idea of the real impact over a full financial year, and of course, that will have implications for Bungie and Destiny in particular. If Destiny continues to underperform, that isn't really going to be good for Bungie, but also, if Marathon additionally underperforms by a significant margin, that will certainly have a more overarching impact on Sony and Bungie's relationship and how supportive Sony are of Bungie's future efforts for Destiny 2 and Marathon will actually be. So, isn't really worth blowing out of proportion, but it's another recognition that things are not ultimately going the way that Sony want them to be. And of course, that same thing applies to Bungie. And we know for a fact that Sony like things to perform, so as we've seen historically, Sony have pulled the plug on various things that are not performing how they want them to be because they can put those assets elsewhere. In the case of Destiny, it could be a bit different because obviously the initial acquisition was pretty significant, so Sony will want to kind of exhaust their opportunities to make as much revenue as possible from Bungie. And I guess as some folks have kind of discussed recently, Renegades being make or break for Destiny, which there's certainly a component of it. If it does badly, that's not going to help. I do think one of the biggest challenges that Bungie have now is obviously community sentiment, and some of the things that they actually need to change are not really about Renegades, right? As I've said before, Renegades exists in this bubble where it could kind of be relatively good or bad. But then there's the rest of the ecosystem around Destiny, and on a basic level, you know, talking about what players kind of think about, even if Renegades is good, there'll still be a lot of people that don't like the way that Destiny's current systems are set up, right? Whether it's the portal, engagement mechanics like power leveling, gear tiering, or other components that Bungie really are struggling with, like quality of life and the actual performance of the game due to the cuts with QA testing. So there are a lot of different pieces which impact how Bungie will actually perform over the next year, but for today, that's all we really have to say. Really, a recognition from Sony once again that there's a reasonably significant markdown on the value of Bungie. And as they said, this is mainly in relation to Destiny 2, which they'll want to say that because with Sony continuing to support Bungie, Marathon is going to be the next thing. And they're hardly going to tell all their investors that their next thing is going to suck, right? So to an extent, that explains why Destiny 2 is being cited as the bigger issue. And I guess as well, Destiny 2 is proven to be the bigger issue currently because Marathon hasn't actually released. So as I said, it will all change, but give us your thoughts down below. A rating would really help us out if you at least found the reporting interesting. I've done my best to interpret the accounting and financial parts of this. Like I said, I'm not an expert, so if you can give any insights in the comment section, feel free to do so. Fingers crossed for Renegades, man. We need some good news. Otherwise, though, I hope you guys have an awesome day. Do your best. You can do it. See you later for Call to Arms. Boom.